And Mary Lou, I think we can now hear your car. So
Okay,
good.
all right.
There's your voice.
Can you hear me talking?
We can. It's a little garbled, but I can hear you and understand you.
Hopefully we'll be at the destination soon. We're actually on vacation in Chicago, so I'm doing crazy multitasking.
Okay. And is Rusty there too?
He is not with me presently, and I don't know if he'll be joining or not.
Okay.
We'll see.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. It's a couple of minutes after the top of the hour. And so good to be here with everyone with, I think, one of the most important and interesting topics we talk about sharing finances with each other. And just a couple of words of introduction on the topic. We titled this No Needy Person Among You, which I'm sure everybody on the phone on Zoom knows is taken from Acts 4, the very important, meaningful description of the life of the first church there in Jerusalem. And let me read that passage, Acts 4:32 through 34. Now, the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power, the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. And of course, this is also a fulfillment of Jesus's words himself, also from Luke. The Acts, of course, is from Luke, and then Luke itself, the Gospel of Luke 14:33, one of Jesus's very difficult sayings about economics. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions, which is probably sort of a head scratcher for the disciples as Jesus said that. A couple of chapters later, we're facing Jesus is talking with the rich young ruler and tells him, you must sell everything you've got and give it to the poor, and then you can come and follow me. And we're told that the disciples thought, man, this is hard stuff. But then there's a reality that really starts to take shape and take form in the Jerusalem church as the Holy Spirit has come upon people. So this morning we want to share some about the difficulties and also the joys and what various communities are doing and the questions that people have on the phone as some are seeking community. So let's start out with a round of introductions. And as you introduce yourself, share where you're from, if you're part of a community, what community you're from, and go ahead and share the what. What is your community doing in terms of sharing financially with each other? And then we'll get into more detail later, but just share that sort of briefly at a high level. Later, I'd like for us also to talk a little bit about the why. Why do we do this? And also the how we would evaluate what we're doing. Does it really bring us more into the full stature of Christ? If you're not part of a community, then you could just share why is this? Why are you on this call? And what is a question or two you might have about financial sharing? And so we can, sort of frame up those questions, have them as we get into things. So I'll introduce myself. I won't answer the question about Hope Fellowship, but I'm going to call on somebody else to answer that. I'm Joe Gatlin. I'm with Hope Fellowship here in Waco, Texas, and also provide some of the coordination work for Nurturing Communities Network. And I'm going to call, and after you introduce yourself, call on the next person so we don't have these awkward silent gaps of wondering who's going to go next. So I'm going to call on Ruth Boardman Alexander, also from Hope Fellowship, and she can also tell us what Hope Fellowship does with financial sharing.
Okay, well, you answered two of the questions. You said my name and where I'm from. So I've been at Hope Fellowship with Joe and Nancy for 20-something years now. We actually began with Hope Community with a shared purse, but it was just two families always, another family in the Gatlins and then our family in the Gatlins. So in the end, what we came up with now, one of the ways that we shared together, besides just kind of informally, I know there's a lot that we don't even know about when someone's aware of a need and we just help each other out and give someone a check or whatever, but we have something called the Mutual Aid Fund. And that is kind of overseen by the pastoral team, which is made up of 4 people. And so when we're aware of needs, sometimes people come with their needs. And then other times someone in their small group or somehow will know that they have maybe an unforeseen medical need, or just they're being stretched a bit. And so that's always a place of real grace. I think I've been on the receiving end, and a lot of times it's unexpected but needed. And we also have learned to try to encourage each other to be vulnerable, because if we're not vulnerable about our needs, then we can't really know how to care for one another in that way. We've encouraged people more recently to please let us know if counseling is something, and if they would, spiritual director or counseling, that we'd like to use those funds in that way too, because we don't want people to be restricted in seeking help in mental health, spiritual health, like that. So that's one of the main ways. I know that Joe and Nancy could add to that though. So yeah, I think that's it. Or do you want me to add more if y'all have some ideas? No. Okay. The mustard seed's a whole nother thing, but we could talk about that. All right, thanks. Let's see. I will call on Rosie.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm Rosie, currently in rural Oregon, not an intentional community yet, but I'm super interested in, I guess, becoming passionate about this topic. I have been for several years, both for living in intentional community one day, which I'm exploring with a few people as well, koinonia, and anyway. And also for the organization I'm part of internationally, which is Servants to Asia's Urban Poor. And I'm especially curious about this topic for sharing across vast differences of power and privilege. So I'm very curious if anyone has experimented with that at all. And how about I call on Bren?
It's just too complicated at Koinonia. I'm Bren Dubé from Koinonia, and the reason why I said that is because we have a staff, and so I'm only talking, when I'm talking about the common purse, I'm only talking about a core group of people, and we have a gradual stepping into the common purse here. Our novices can retain private possessions, and if they own a house somewhere, and then over time, as you move towards entering the covenant, which is a long-term relationship, then you're fully in the common purse. Right now, we all earn an allowance, if you will, from Koinonia, and we can take some of it none of it, part of it, all of it. And it's placed in the common purse. We just entered a new phase where even though some of us don't take an allowance, what we would receive is put into Koinonia Farm Inc. gives that to the Koinonia Fellowship to be used for purposes of helping one another. And we've had a very, very good experience so far from that common bank account. We all do get a personal budget. That may change in the future, but we each year turn in, like if I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example. Like Elizabeth has a subscription to the New York Times. Well, she can make that list, and she has 2 dogs, so she can put something on her personal budget for caring for her dogs for the year because she has an estimate. So she just gets that, and she can deal with it, spend it as indicated. But all the rest sits in our bank account, and then say someone has a root canal. And whatever insurance we have does not cover that. And then we go to the community, and that so far we've been able to meet everyone's needs. We don't spend a lot of money. Some of that is because we live in rural Georgia. And but if we want to go to a play in Atlanta, or we want to go spend the day in Atlanta and visit museums, then we can agree, and we don't all have to go, but then we all agree that money can be spent out of our common purse for that. So I know this is a little longer than probably I should have been, but I'm happy to answer questions, especially if I was confusing. But thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thanks, Bryn. Why don't you go ahead and call on someone? We'll come back to questions later.
That's right. I'll call on Toby.
It's so good to be with everyone. Just happy to see every one of you. And this is a really interesting topic and discussion. I'm eager to hear from everyone. Looks like I'm the only Bruderhof person on today, which is not always the case. The Bruderhof, from its origins 102 years ago, has been a common purse community. So none of us members own anything, and all our needs are provided for by the community. What fascinates me about this topic, this subject, is how the important thing is not the system, but the spirit of it. And so more about that later, but it's the spirit of voluntary giving, generosity, that is crucial. It has to be filled with the spirit. So although, the best system in the world is not necessarily life-giving. And so more on that later, perhaps. Ted, let's hear from you.
Hi, Ted Godwin here. No, the name is my wife's. I'm with New Revelations Collegiate Mission. We're trying to establish an intentional Christian community for college students attending secular universities here in North Texas at Texas Women's University and the University of North Texas, and some others that are in the area. We charge rent for students, and then out of the rent, we provide for costs and future building expansion, we hope, and also to purchase their food needs and things like that. And we do offer financial assistance when they need it. We've forgiven students months of rent, and we also sometimes hire them to do odd jobs to help them out financially. So we're more on a typical business style nonprofit organization than an intentional community with any kind of shared financing. But our students are still kind of under their parents' wings, and so they still have that connection. So they are adults, but just barely. So it's a different kind of scenario. And then the population will be consistently transitory as they graduate and move away. So short-term stays. So kind of a different community, but that's what we're trying to get to. And let's see. How about Nathan?
Thank you. My name is Nathan Ralston. I'm in Saltillo, Mexico, and we are part of a church, the Iglesia de Cristo, in the neighborhood of El Salvador. And basically, we're in this process of becoming more of an intentional community together. Some of the issues that we're facing are right now, as more and more folks are becoming more and more connected to the neighborhood. One of the families is this be Roberto and Dania, and their family are spending their days within the neighborhood, working, eating, sharing life together with the children and the neighbors. Obviously, eating isn't free, and being able to work, at the church building does involve some costs, but it's an intentional process. And so supporting and being involved in that together is something that we're beginning to face more in a more tangible way now, versus just kind of everybody in their own life separate from one another. Some of the things that we have done in the past, I think we've shared before, like piñatas, and then the chickens and things like that provide some income, some more successful than others, and then sharing of that with one another. But we're at the initial stages still, and taking small positive steps towards being more sustainable, but still taking just small steps at this point. So thank you. I don't know, I actually had to come in a little bit late, so I don't know who has spoken. I'll go with Joe. Hello, Joe. If Joe hasn't already spoken, then I'll, okay.
Hi, Nathan. Good to be with you guys. Joe Bowling with Inglewood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. We are a church community. We are not officially an intentional community, and we are not a common purse community. But I mean, similar to what Ruth shared, find a number of ways within the congregation, formally and informally, to share economically with one another. We have what we call our pantry fund, and that's a formal way to do that, with funds set aside and often given specifically for sharing for others. Folks are encouraged to bring any need that they have economically, and there's a small group of kind of church staff and non-church staff, just members that meet with them and see that need is cared for. But again, like similar that others have shared, a lot of those things are just kind of done more informally at the kind of friendship level or the small group level, and the pantry fund kind of never gets involved. And I would say the vast majority of cases. We are also a little different in that we have two sort of big kind of aspects of common work in Daystar Childcare that employs about 40 folks, and Inglewood CDC that employs about 20 folks. And as you can imagine, just in setting each of our salaries and deciding, what we'll need for compensation there's a fair amount of give and take and economic sharing that happens there. This person intentionally takes less so that this person can take more, and we can kind of balance our budget at the end of the year, et cetera. So there's a wonderful and beautiful examples that I could share there. I think a lot of what we try to do too is just kind of create the kind of proximity and community infrastructure so that, we have homes that are available to be shared. We have cars that are homes that are dedicated for sharing, cars that are dedicated for sharing, other things that are dedicated for sharing, though each of us may own our own car and home that may also be made available for sharing. And so just a lot of nuance to it, like I don't imagine we'd find in other communities too. That's enough for me. How about Finn?
Yeah, so I'm Finn, and I moved to the Catskills region of New York last year. And then I've spent the time here trying to formulate a concept for what this intentional community is going to look like. So far, I'm just by myself and still working on the concept. So about 10 years ago, I was a member of a raw food group, and they met like once a month. And one of the things they did was to bring things they didn't need anymore. And they could then take some other things that were there, they could take home. So they're kind of like an exchange of things that were not needed by anybody. So when I became a member of a church later on, they had a thrift store. And I think it was very commercial. There was none of the proceeds really made it out into the needy community around us. So I suggested that they should adopt this concept of dropping off things and people could pick up things without using any money. But that didn't really fly. Nobody could really understand that. But when I moved here, I had things that I needed to release to other people. So I discovered that there was a mutual aid group here in town. So I became a member, and whenever I have something that needs to be repurposed or given to somebody, that's where it's going to go. I haven't really tried to move anything the other way, but that's what I do so far. And it's good. I think that's what you should do. Try to not throw it in the garbage if somebody else can use it. So next person could be, how about, there was a Nick here before. I see Saitun.
I am not in a community right now. I'm just listening and learning and would one day hope to be in one.
Nick, why don't you go next?
Sounds good. My name's Nick Terman Bryant. I was previously part of Springwater Community in Portland and now living in north of Seattle in Washington State. And bringing the question of, we have different families that might end up sharing space with us, but we'll probably not have the same kind of covenant commitment, at least not initially. And so just eager to hear from other groups how they've learned in this progression of sharing resources, what that looks like. I'll hand it off to Mary Lou.
Hi, I'm not driving now, which makes it more comfortable. I'm from Springwater Community, as Nick said, and just briefly, the experiment that we're doing right now is trying to equalize the cost of housing. It just makes sense because in our situation, when we arrived, 12 years ago, the cost of housing was very, very different than it is right now. So we have a young family who just bought a house and they spent, I don't know what it was, $350,000, and we spent 100,000 basically. And we're asking people to live in our community. We live, one of the things we commit to is to live in close proximity to one another. So people don't have the option to, shop for, a house that maybe meets their budget if they're going to commit to living near us. So it just made sense that we would talk about like, how do we equalize? And Nick was actually very much a part of like figuring out different, Nick is our spreadsheet guy, but like figuring out like, how do we try to equalize this in some form? And, very quickly it gets very complicated, but we tried to find the most basic and simple way, which was just like cost per bedroom. There's some people renting, rent prices have gone up too. Some people owning, and of course there's all kinds of differences between people who rent and own, and how do you equalize that? It's just, you're just not gonna, it's gonna be a small little step in the direction of a little more equitable, a little more living into kingdom, economics, as opposed to our current system, which is there's nothing just about it. So I would say currently, I mean, there's a lot I could say about it, but that's maybe the nugget of the sharing that we're doing. There's other ways in which that's also taken form. We have a common fund. A really like interesting question increasingly is becoming like, if we don't have great need among us, if we're all able to provide for ourselves pretty well, then what might we think about in terms of people around us, and what does it look like to spread that goodness beyond our own little group? So yeah, there's other fun little ways that we're doing sharing right now. One quick one I would say that it just kind of has sprung up organically, is that we have an ADU that has our washer and dryer in it, but we recently rented that out to a refugee family. And so it became, it didn't feel so good to be going in and out of their space. When we had community members living there, it was super easy, and we liked that contact. But with this family wanting to honor their privacy, so since we have a family that bought a house right across the street, have a garage with a washer and dryer, they just give us access to their garage. So we're just using their washer and dryer. Well, turns out that, another 2 families are living in the same yard, and the washer and dryer isn't convenient for the one. So anyway, so now there's 3 of us using the one set of washer and dryers, and we all have access to getting in and out of the garage. And we have a common sort of like group me where we can, communicate with each other about who's washing and drying. It's just a great like little connection and shared life, and it's just like a wonderful when that form of sharing is easy, and it's sort of a win-win. So anyway, I could say more, but that's a few of the examples of some of the things we're trying to do. And I'm going to just send it back to Joe for you to pick who else. I can't see everybody on my screen, so.
Sure. Well, Noelle, how about we go to you?
Okay. I'm Noelle. I'm from Grain of Wheat Church Community in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And we've been around for about 40 years, I think. And so we've tried various things over the years. We had a Jubilee fund for a while, which was helping us to pay off each other's mortgages. And but that got complicated. And as people moved, if people moved and stuff like that. So that kind of didn't continue. Now what we have is similar to what a lot of you have. Ours is called Benevolent Fund, where needs can be made known to this group that's combined with some the pastoral team and leadership team, and it can come through them personally or through their small group leader if they know of something. And so yeah, like it's not an ongoing. Like we had one just this last winter where somebody lost employment, so they needed some income, but it's not designed to be ongoing money every month for somebody. It's not designed to replace employment money. But we could do it for 6 months, you know, in that time, he's found other work, and so that's great. That kind of a thing is what it's for. The other things that we do, we have within the group, we have a group called Seeds Housing, and they own 2 houses, which are designed to rent out to refugee families, because here we have, it's sort of a dearth of housing for larger families, and some of the families that, what we were finding is families that came from other countries sometimes have larger families, and you can't just get an apartment for a family with 7 kids or something like that. So that's why this group decided to work on providing housing that could maybe accommodate some of these larger families. So they have, right now, they have 2 houses that are used. I think that accommodates 3 families between the 2 houses. And then the other thing is that although we're in a place that was quite kind of on the edge, you know, of being a needy neighborhood, when we all moved in, it has become somewhat more gentrified, which people accuse us of being part of, because we're live here and we're stable and so yeah, now the area has gone up a lot. But where we worship is just a neighborhood over, which is still pretty needy. Like there's a lot of street people, a lot of street activity and things like that. So we walk from our nice neighborhood into and past a lot of street people. And so that's the conversation right now. And also where we meet, it's an old church, and they converted the upper part of it into housing, again, for families on the low income spectrum. And we're part of that. We're part of on the board with that housing co-op. So there's all these different ways, but it's here in Winnipeg, the street people issue is becoming quite a big issue. And so that's our conversation now. Is there something that we can do to work with them, or, you know, to be led by them into what would be helpful? And I don't know either if everybody's gone now or not.
David, I think you haven't introduced yourself.
Right. Yeah, I was having computer troubles there to start. I'm David Horn. I live in the Panhandle of Texas. Right now, we really don't have a formal community. It's me, my wife, and my daughter, and her kids. We're in the process of trying to establish what we call a healing ranch, a place where people can come and heal spiritually, emotionally, and physically. I don't really have any history, really. You know, our finances is family, so it's kind of different than what y'all are talking about. But we are wanting to establish a community, so I'm here to learn today. So,
And I think that brings us to Nancy. I think everybody else has introduced themselves. So Nancy.
So I'm Nancy, and part of Hope Fellowship here as well. Ruth spoke of some of what goes on, and yeah, she mentioned briefly Mustard Seed Fund, which is another way in which we share. It's for members of Hope Fellowship or people who are very involved in the life of Hope Fellowship, and the ability to invest money in it. And also to take out loans, interest-free loans, revolving loans. And so that has been operating for, I don't know, 8-10 years, something like that. And that's been a really helpful thing. At times we have to kind of promote it again. Not everyone in Hope Fellowship participates in it, but it's open to anyone. And you know, I guess listening to everyone's sharing, I just think, you know, it's just so fun to hear the different ways that the Spirit of God prompts us to share with one another. And, you know, thinking about 2 at least two things that in my experience and in my life, this helps grow. And one is generosity, and the other one is accountability. And Joe and I have lived in both common purse households for several years in different locations. And now for many years in Hope Fellowship, it's not a common purse. And each one has its pluses. So I just think, I guess my experience has been to not hold too tight to a particular form exactly, but to be open to how the Spirit wants to grow us in generosity and accountability about our finances. One example of how that happens, and spontaneously many years ago now, one of our members, a single mom with 2 children, she was not making a living wage. And the church came alongside her while her children were young for several years, actually, out of the mutual aid, giving her a monthly check because this idea that none of us be in need. Well, she was, although she was so good. She's always been so good with the way she handles money. But, I think some people were skeptical. Is that going to work? Is she just coming around because that check is going to her? The interesting thing was that she, at that point, was one of, well, I won't say of how many because I don't really know, but she was a very faithful tither all along, and had a lot of testimonies to share with the rest of us. So we all learned so much from her. And then the time came when both of her kids were out of high school, and that stopped. And she was very glad for that to stop, very ready for that to stop, and has continued very involved in our church and in giving in many different ways. So there are a lot of ways, one other thing, I guess, and I'll stop, but is I'm just interested with you, Nathan, here that this part of the reason we chose as a church not to go common purse was because we are a bilingual church wanting to attract people from other cultures. And the immigrants that were a part of us, many of them having come to the United States with a big part of it was to be able to send money back to their families. And so it didn't feel like the common purse model was going to really work real well for us because of that. So each of us has to figure out our situations, our context, who God is bringing in our midst. And, but it's just a beautiful thing to hear all the many ways that the Spirit shows up in this regard.
One other thing I would add about Hope Fellowship, well, maybe 2 other things. We did decide, or a number of us did, when the COVID stimulus checks came through to those of us in the United States, we asked for folks to put 50% of their stimulus check into a pot that would really then help us make it through the pandemic. If a family or an individual lost income as a result of the pandemic, we would have a fund there to really help people make it through. We're fortunate no one really in Hope Fellowship and the membership really suffered any big financial loss. We never tapped that fund for that. We still have some of that fund left, and how we've really used it is really with neighbors and relatives and so forth that are sort of one-off from us on a very regular basis that did experience some real hardship through the pandemic. So we've been able to use that fund that way. One other thing is Hope Fellowship is an all volunteer operation. We don't have any paid staff, and yet we people give pretty generously and to the common fund. And so as a result, we usually have extra cash on hand because our own infrastructure is not requiring it. So we do make it a regular practice in our yearly budget of giving 40% away. And then probably another, I'm guessing 15% of our budget is the mutual aid, 15 to 20%. So most of what we're coming in with is really money that we're able to give out and to various organizations or individuals in the neighborhood where we are. I think I'd like to open it up. Well, maybe I'll call on someone as we open it up. Talk about the why. I mean, we've talked a little bit about the what here, but why is this important for us as friends, as followers of Jesus, as communities gathered in Jesus's name? And Toby, you spoke a bit about the spirit of the thing. I don't know if the spirit really begins to answer why. Nancy began to talk about the spirit. So why, maybe you just could jump in there. Why is this important to you and to the Bruderhof? And others can pitch in then as to why you see this important. Maybe that's theologically, maybe it's, some very practical benefits. Why do we do this?
Yeah, gladly. I'll make a start. I mean, the account from Acts says that there was no needy person among them. So clearly it's important that among the fellowship, those that are our brothers and sisters who we've been called together with to follow Jesus, that we look after each other and meet the needs of each one. So that's a really basic why. And another reason is to strive to be free of the power of mammon, possessiveness, greed, selfishness. And that, being part of human nature, is something none of us can just shed in one heroic decision, or even a commitment to, say, a common community structure. We're still selfish by nature. And so it's a lifelong journey, struggle actually against our selfish nature, whatever system we find ourselves in, whatever our church community or fellowship that we're part of has decided to do as a system. So what I have noticed and what I learned with my wife in our 6-month assignment among the Englewood brothers and sisters in Indianapolis about 8 years ago was that regardless of a common purse structure, which I know as within the Bruderhof, there can be a wonderful spirit of generosity, of sharing, of sensitivity to the needs of our neighbors, our brothers and sisters, and there were just many interesting, delightful experiences along the way of discovering how the essentials of it can be very alive, very strong. And that's the spirit I'm talking about, the spirit of sharing, of generosity, of meeting each other's needs, of showing love in practical ways, can be very strong and alive and vibrant in a group within a fellowship that has decided not to do common purse as a system. And it made, as I experienced and discovered these things happening among the people of the Englewood Christian Church congregation, I thought back to my Bruderhof home and examples that I felt actually struck and even judged about in my conscience, where and among us, there is selfishness, there is greed, there is trying to get good things for ourselves. And I realized that no system is perfect. No system, however good, actually meets what Jesus is calling for here and what is best for the thriving and flourishing of people, both within and outside the fellowship. So it was another, connects with our previous meeting about what we can learn from other communities within a network like this one. Someone else should contribute.
Well, building on what Toby said, holding all things in common here, we find that here at Koinonia, we find that we have more to share. So by sharing ourselves, we have more to share with people in need. But as Toby pointed out, that's being done by, I mean, we've given, I've heard many different examples that that's going on in other communities that do not have what they call, or the, traditionally what we think of as the common purse. So I really like the whole idea of it's the spirit, and it's to, I think to, we help each other not we help each other, I think, not to get too materialistic. We remind each other, and by doing that, and by living more simply, we have enough to share with other people, and are happy to do so.
One of the things that we've said in Hope Fellowship, well, actually, when we did away with our common treasury household, and we were sort of beginning to figure out, well, what do finances really look like for Hope Fellowship? And David Jansen from Reba Place, who many of you know, was visiting with us, and really challenged us that, we could still have the commitment to having no one in need, and that we could really have a commitment to generosity. There were 3 principles we identified, and we could have a commitment to detaching ourselves from our possessions, even if we still had private ownership. That was a spiritual journey that we should be working on. So we came up with a statement that identified those things. And so I've got one story about detachment. Nancy and I were part of a common treasury household in Chicago for 9 years in an inner city neighborhood that was a missional household. Out of that grew many things. That was a wonderful experience. In Waco, when we came here, we were part of another common treasury household for about 4 years that really sort of struggled along and didn't have the right spirit at times. And then we had a real break in things. And it was after that break that Hope Community and Hope Fellowship came about. And another couple had approached us and said, we'd really like to try this too. And so we called in Virgil Vogt from Reba Place, again, somebody many of you know, and Hilda Carper came with him, and we had a meeting. There were 6 of us really at that point, looking at the common, were we going to do a common purse household again? And I'll never forget this. We were really talking about, cashing in everything at that point, even a little IRA that Nancy and I had. That was about all we had at that point, and putting that all in the pot. And then we got to talking around the circle. Well, here are things that we need. And Nancy and I said, well, one thing we need everybody to understand is, Nancy grew up in Uruguay, and occasionally we really need to make a trip back to Uruguay. And at that point, Virgil said, I just need to call time out here. He said, really, what you're doing is, what you need to be doing in this is turning everything over with empty hands and trusting vertically in God, not trying to trust your brothers and sisters horizontally, that they're going to provide for your needs or your wants. So we had experienced two common treasury households, common purse households before that, but never, I don't think, had I really crossed over that bridge of, well, this is really about trusting in God. I mean, that's really what this is. Nancy and I no longer live in a common treasury household, but I look back at that as a really significant event where finance, in my life, where finances began to take a more, what I'd say, gospel, approach to them. Of this is not ours, and if God blesses us with some things, well, then it's really there for the sake of God's realm, for the sake of the kingdom of God. And I agree with everything that's been said. There's a variety of ways to do this as we listen to the Spirit, but it really is about abandoning everything, I think, to God. Others about the what the spirit of this means, or maybe has it worked? Has it brought your community more into the full stature of Christ? Or other questions from those of you that are seeking things?
I did have a question for Nancy. You mentioned invest and make loans. And is there that you can run your own bank? Is there interest involved in the investing and loaning? Not at this time.
No, there never has been. And, we're learning. I mean, there's not a book out there exactly to create this, right? So we've learned in one of we've had a couple of hiccups where people defaulted, folks who moved away from here and that kind of thing. But you know what? I sent out, because I serve on the leadership team for that right now. It's sort of a rotating thing. And I sent out an email to the membership, explaining our situation and who among us was willing to put anything that we had invested into the fund to help cover this default, because we need to have that money there if anyone, for whatever purpose, needs to take their investment out, we need to be able to pay them. And some of us had said yes, but we still needed $500 more. And lo and behold, a member from way back who's been gone from Hope Fellowship for a long time said, I want to do that. I want to pay it forward because I had difficulty repaying one of my loans years ago, and I want to do that. So last week, we got his check for $500 and covering the loan. And I was able to write this fellow who no longer lives here, who went through a really difficult patch in his life, and let him know that a prior person had paid it forward by covering a good hunk of the default. He was really blessed by that and said, that's what I want to do in the future. So it was just a beautiful experience of how generosity encourages generosity. Yeah. So, but yes, no interest.
I'm curious for folks who are trying to live these radical and beautiful experiments of sharing. On the one hand, there's having no needy among you, which I think is a really good place to put the accent. On the other hand is this question of inequality, which I know can sometimes feel like it's an erosive force for connection and sense of commitment. I'm curious to what extent these conversations have been linked within the community, not only trying to have shared resources to make sure that there's no one who has need, but also mindfulness about how much everyone has and the extent to which that can cause, I don't know, disruption or create friction in relationships.
I would say just a really super practical way in which that can kind of show itself. Practical is maybe the right reason, but sort of like what we noticed, especially early on, with different people having different levels of income and um, resources to spend, that some people wanted to go out and eat and other people wouldn't go out because they didn't feel like they could afford it or didn't budget for that. And so then you had some missing out on social connections and interactions because of money. And that to me is just like so counter anything kingdom, community value. Like, so I think for sure, uh, uh, I think that the bottom line is that we open up this whole arena to conversation. And I think even that's pretty radical, just to be able to say how we spend our money deeply, deeply matters. And in fact, Jesus maybe put it as the number one, like affront to love. And if love doesn't take on these super like clear and practical arena of money and how we spend it and resources and what we have, then we can't really, it isn't really loving. And so I think to have the conversation, I think I'm grateful that we are having those conversations. And I think there's just a way lots more. I really like what you said, Nancy, about just seeing it as a like trajectory of growth instead of a sort of like we do or we don't, but to say growing into accountability and generosity to me is just a beautiful like invitation, and knowing that all of us have parts of us that are anxious, that are that are concerned about our own survival. Like that's just going to be a part of being human. I think that we're going to that's going to be a piece of what we're dealing with ourselves and each other. But if we can be transparent about that, and we can say, how can we challenge one another to generosity and accountability? I feel like that's just a really beautiful invitation. And I think that as we grow into that, and like some of these examples, like the one you gave, Nancy, and others, like the joy that comes from, seeing an abundance that is then beginning to overflow into, goodness, but it does. And again, bringing in the whole piece of like, ultimately it's trusting God. Because I think that if we look for like this to all, like to get reinforced or get a huge blessing out of everything that we're doing in the moment, right, isn't always going to pan out that way. And it may take a long time before the fruit of what we're giving actually overflows into something that's really like obviously, beautiful or wonderful. And so ultimately it being a surrender and love of God that we're expressing through these things that we do is, I think, really beautiful and essential.
I need to break for just a second, then we'll come back to what Mary Lou was sharing and what Nancy wants to share. We're at the top of the hour, and we've always tried to sort of say, well, here's a break. It's a full hour. Some people may need to leave. Others of us will stay on for another half hour to just talk about this more. Before people step off, anybody steps off, let me mention, I am gathering a page of resources that will have links to some documents from different communities. We have a statement from the Bruderhof about their common treasury. Bren has sent me the same thing for Koinonia, which is a somewhat different model, very helpful. I have a whole sheaf of documents from Reba Place, which has for years been in a very sort of structured common treasury, and so I'll have that too. I've got the statement from Hope Fellowship that we have used, and and list a couple of books. There are some excellent books out there. Virgil Voigt's Treasures in Heaven is something that's meant a great deal to a lot of us. John Alexander, who is not with us anymore, but from Church of the Sojourners, has another book, Your Money or Your Life. So I'll list those. And if any of the communities on the phone have any sort of document that you use that just sets out a vision or sets out some practical things that you've done, please go ahead and send that on to me in the next day or two, and I will include that. I think this is really worth having a whole page of resources on our website because it's important. But come back to the topic at hand. Nancy, you were going to say something.
Yeah, Nick, I just appreciate the question that you bring up. And I think it's one that we have to continually be looking at. And still, I'm not saying you're not saying this either, but still with a great amount of humility, because, I think what we're hearing here is when we think we got the right system, perfectly aligned and everything is going to be equitable, we realize, no, after a little while, we're not. Sometimes things like that will end up creating that sense of, oh boy, scarcity, so that I become more holding on to what I have rather than generous. So I'm not at all trying to explain what the answers to all of this are. I'm just aware of that, having gone through it some in my own experience. What I would just add also is that what I sense God calling us, Christ calling us to, is a change of heart and mind, a whole paradigm shift, if you will. And so the more experiences we encourage each other to have, our hearts, my heart changed. It's my relationship with this sister in Christ. I've gotten to see her, and she does not operate from a place of scarcity. Even with this, her small salary that she's had, and now no longer working, she finds the money to share with her family, with her mom in Mexico, who has a lot of health needs. She doesn't operate from scarcity. She operates from abundance. And to me, that is so much more life-giving than trying to nickel and dime it and make sure we're all, but I hear and I still wrestle with the power imbalance. It's something, I think we'll wrestle with the rest of our lives. I will say there's a lot of intangibles that get shared in Hope Fellowship. It's anything from a ride to the airport to costume for my kid for their school, or, a pot that I need for cooking, or a car for this amount of time. People just put it on the email, and all kinds of things are constantly being shared across, which means then people don't have to go out and buy something, for example. So even if you don't even have the money to buy it, that's where you go, and often the need is met, So in my own life, I've just found that to be a real healthy place to approach this, not meaning that it doesn't have to continually be dealt with, but a place of abundance, rather than of scarcity.
Yeah, I appreciated the question too from Nick, because I think something that we found, like when one family is coming back for the fourth time needing money, what we found is usually or not usually, I shouldn't say usually, but often it's not just about money. When there's always a need, and so that we had to broaden our benevolent fund questions, and we have somebody that meets with them to see what is the need, and are there other ways that it can be met, and are there other, and then they meet with them again to reevaluate. Is this going well for you? Is this continuing need? Sometimes there's mental health issues that go along with it. We just found that very often, if you just have a family coming back and people kind of go like, what? The fourth time? And they don't want to give as much anymore. And then we have to have this whole conversation about generosity and scarcity and all that. But there is another issue very often, and that we take a look at that other issue as well and don't just focus on the money. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to add on. Well, one, I agree with what you were saying, that there's sometimes something else, deeper conversations of need. One thing I was thinking, we were talking about mutual aid, is that we don't really share when that happens with the family, but sometimes when we've given gifts, we don't publicize it. But sometimes we have times where those people, we invite them to share if they'd like, so that the church is encouraged, because it is encouraging if you can see when a need has been met. And yeah, like I said before, there's a lot of grace and feelings of grace when that happens. But what Mary Lou was saying about conversations, I think that's constant, that we need to revisit. We've had times where we focused on that more in our small groups, and depending on the group, there was more transparency, but it's always a place of growth, I think, for us in Hope Fellowship. I know there's, I listen to some of y'all and I think, there's a longing in me of deeper sharing than we have, even though it's complicated. It wouldn't be the whole church, but like, how can we have more accountability? A lot of us don't struggle financially, or we might even have like a family member that would jump in and give us a loan if we needed it or something, and so that all those little other ways that we can get support I know for me, can cause me to forget to put my trust in God's provision, because I have these like safety nets or whatever. And so I think that can be a challenge for those of us who aren't in Common Purse. How do we really trust God? How do we not think we have to hold on to things, and to keep talking to each other so we have that accountability? Because if you don't know anything about my income or how I'm spending money, I can just, I'm on my own to be accountable. So I appreciate the conversations that we have time and again.
I think a litmus test, not the only litmus test, and it's not a perfect one, but for the difference between a sort of standard church and a church that is, or community that is together, is what has been said, that we're able to talk about finances. I mean, it's so countercultural to be private about finances, and to think, in a standard church, well, you wouldn't, people would be sort of, we can't, we're not really taking care of our own because it's got to go out. But I think that there is some accountability, and that there is generosity, and we're encouraged to meet each other's needs. Is maybe not the most important thing we do. I think maybe more important is the shared life that we have together. But it is a really something that's very important. Something I aspire to live by, I think was captured so well by Paul, the Apostle Paul, and I think I'm pretty sure it's Philippians. I've learned to live with a lot, and I've learned to live with a little. And I found that at different points in my life, and that has to do with generosity and scarcity, and being content with what God has provided for today. And then, if we've been in a position of having more, not to feel guilty about that, but just to really commit it to God's kingdom, to the realm of God, and how can we best live with this, that we have more right now. And that, yeah, we can't solve all these problems, but we can live within God's grace, I think.
All those thoughts go, I think, a long way for me in expressing the spirit of this matter, of this challenge, of this. It's not just a topic, it's actually an important part of our commitment, our walk, our discipleship. I'd love to hear from you, Joe, of your experience at Englewood and your thoughts on this.
I think it looks like Joe's video may be frozen there.
Maybe he's in traffic.
He's certainly not looking at the road right now, but
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I have a question. How much of the holistic goal or mission statement of your community determines how you do your finances? Where I'm coming from is, you know, we've talked to some people about joining us in community, but their idea of the lifestyle they want is different than kind of where we're going. Does that have a big impact when you initially develop your community, the vision, and then asking people to go on that path of that vision? Does that help with this financial stuff? I mean, how's that play? I'm just asking dumb questions.
I would say yes. I think a common purpose. We started out the series with, how do we find a common purpose, agreement on what is most important to us within whatever group comes together to try to live out the way of Jesus together. I think it's really crucial that we work on finding that agreement, that one-mindedness of what are the important things. Is it important that we share? And if so, how?
I think having something, David, that it really defines a common core commitment of people that, and the common purse is a very radical and effective way of, everything goes in, that's going to define a whole lot for people as they defines almost everything. I think other things, for Hope Fellowship, thinking of it historically, was our neighborhood. I mean, we never required everybody to live in the neighborhood, but it was very clear the focus and center of our life was going to be in this neighborhood, which meant many people over the years have moved in to the neighborhood, but also being a lower income neighborhood sort of defined us as countercultural in a way that I think has really helped us. I think other groups have done it with commitment to a mission, a particular ministry that everybody's going to need to be committed to in some very real and tangible way. And that may be what you have there with your healing ranch, but something that is adding some definition and some sense of boundary. This helps define us as a people gathered in the name of Jesus with, it needs to have some definition to it, I think.
Okay, thanks.
Joe says he's having trouble reconnecting, but he's trying, so.
Okay, good.
Nathan, I'm curious, how do you see this conversation in Saltillo? And even with the little association with the other communities that you guys are involved in?
Yeah, so we're in relationship, virtual relationship, and then we've done some one visit with the folks in Oaxaca, and we're in relationship with others from Toluca, and then in Costa Rica with Ruth Padilla. And so this is again, it's a process, and it's thanks to the pandemic, actually. Obviously with Hope Fellowship and everyone from Inglewood as well, and Ruderhof. But in terms of this specific topic, what we've done is tried to glean from what's going on in Costa Rica, what's going on in Toluca, Oaxaca, and learn from them as well, and also offer what the Spirit of Christ is doing among us. And so I think that's encouraged us to take these small intentional steps together. And so much of this resonates with we do have as a congregation a fund, treasury from tithes and offerings. How's that dispersed? And is that relevant for the lives of people who are coming from very separate places? But as we take these more intentional steps, what we're finding is that the common purse, it becomes more and more relevant. Financial ties become more and more practical for us. So sharing meals together is something that has helped. Having the internet where we share lives together by being in the same place throughout the day, and how that opens up relationships among the children who live on the same street or behind us, or what have you. And then welcoming others into working together is all connected. And so for our experience, that's kind of where we're at. And it's context specific, but it does help in terms of becoming more and more in relationship with one another, and opening up to how we may share our lives, share who we are, share what we have with one another in Christ. I think Joe's back. So Joe, if you're ready, I'll let you continue speaking.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. Well, I mean, I didn't feel like I had a ton to contribute, because I've really just appreciated absolutely everything that's been shared. And I really loved what Nancy had to say about not holding on too tightly to any one system. Things change so quickly. I mean, I could just tell you that there's just been a sea change at Inglewood over the last 4 years with what's happened in our neighborhood relative to prices, et cetera. And again, your system is going to continue to have to be flexible, to change the dynamics of your community, both the church community as well as the surrounding communities. I really appreciated that. Really appreciated Toby's continued emphasis on the Spirit and the spirit of our life together, et cetera. And I really appreciated Nick's question about inequalities, but then I really just appreciated what Nancy had to say in terms of yes, and yes, we should continue to have a generosity of spirit that wants to make sure that inequalities that are just given can be mitigated, can be blunted to the extent that they can, so that there's at least a greater equity. But again, there's a little bit of a pushback from her that I think is appropriate in terms of, that equality is so elusive. And sometimes the more we point out those inequalities within our community, it can create a culture that can be difficult, et cetera. or just elusive. I think that the only other thing I would add is just, and we're kind of saying it in different ways, but being attentive to the kind of culture that we create and the spirit embedded within that culture. Just I think of, you just think of the way that we spend we've talked about the way that we spend our money, but a lot of that is just the way we spend our time. And so if we create a culture where in the evenings, it's not, let's all go out and, for steak dinners out on the town kind of a thing. If that's our culture, then those inequities are going to be great and they'll be very apparent, etc. But if the culture is a little bit more of, let's meet in the community garden for a pitch-in, and everyone brings what they can bring. That kind of culture that I think flows out of a spirit of generosity, a spirit of caring, a spirit of mutuality, etc., will create better practices over time. And so one of the gifts, that have been given, I think, to us is just a spirit, a culture of being generous with one another and being fairly modest in our lifestyles. And so, it's just no one at Inglewood drives like a brand new car or just a big fancy car. And it just like you wouldn't like there's no rule against it. There's no system that bars you from getting a big fancy new car. You just wouldn't, like, it's not part of the culture. And so again, there's no law against it. And I don't even think anyone would be shamed or publicly, forced to face the music if they bought a big fancy new car. You just wouldn't, because part of it is just like, well, not everyone, like, even if you could afford that, not everyone could. And why would you want to create that sort of division in that way into a community of and a community culture of generosity, of mutuality, can do a lot to bridge some of the inequalities, but to engender more feelings of true kind of kinship. I don't know. Hopefully that made some sense.
No, it did. I was thinking also, Joe, that part of the culture that we should all be encouraging is within our communities a culture of really listening to God. And, if we can be encouraging each other spiritually, then, somebody comes up with, wow, the situation in Afghanistan is really serious right now, and we should respond. Then, if we trust that brother or sister is listening to God, then by golly, we need to listen. And it may be, well, there's scores of needs in the world, but this brother or sister has really placed this one before us, and maybe it's time to give again. So I think that's one way that we here try to proceed, is really listening to God and listening to each other to see where the Lord may be leading us. I think that's in the same spirit of, nobody's going to go out and get the big fancy car because we're trusting we're all listening to God. And that doesn't really seem to be what Jesus was about. But I agree also, we're not shaming either. But
But what several of you have said, the relational piece, the meals together, the pitch-ins, I think you call them, Joe, and that's really the crux of it, obviously founded on Christ, but because when we get to know each other, it's kind of like with the community in El Salvador that Shalom Missions has related to for 30 years this year. They aren't just those people. We've eaten pupusas. They've eaten, food here at our table. They're our friends, they're family. So it matters, what's happening to them or what's happening to us. They will call us if there are tornadoes or we'll hear from them. So it becomes very mutual. And they have a lot less dollars than we do, but there's something that's happening that isn't the way the world operates, of doling out the same check to everybody. and I realize that can sound flippant, but that there is a reality that I've been able to taste that tells me there's something here, to pay attention to. So yeah, the relational piece is just super, super important, for this for whatever we do financially to really be spirit-led. So yeah.
Thank you. Couldn't agree more.
Anybody else have a closing word? We're coming up to the end of our allotted time here. So let me say, Noel or Joe, if you have anything from your respective communities in writing you want to send along, that would be great, I think, or anybody else that think would make a good resource for people. Would appreciate it. We'll say that those of us sort of regularly involved in nurturing communities are working on the October retreat, October 7th through 10, Revolutionary Peacemaking, that will be in Lucan, Kentucky, Camp Lucan, and we'll have registration out probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks, ready to go on that, and hope you can be joining us and be praying about that as to whether you can make that trek and have some time of fellowship and all together. So great. Good to see everybody.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Been
God
very
bless.
good.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.